What were the controversial views that Spinoza espoused in his philosophy? The first view that many people identify with Spinoza is pantheism. Now, pantheism is the view that God is identical with nature, and this clearly goes against traditional monotheistic belief. The traditional idea is that God exists as an independent being, and indeed existed before anything else did. At some point, God creates the universe, but God remains transcendent. He causes the universe, and in a sense, it may even be thought by some strands of religion to be somehow in God. But God himself remains an independent being who chose to create the universe at a certain point. That's the view of classical monotheism. For Spinoza, in contrast, the opening 15 propositions of the Ethics are devoted to an argument to show that God is identical with nature. God quite literally is to be identified with the universe. Now, whether he's to be identified with the laws that govern the universe or with the actual universe itself and all the things in it, including, for example, the computer you are currently using, on that view, that would be somehow God. That's a controversy among Spinoza scholars. But either way, rather than being a transcendent being, Spinoza's God is immanent within the universe. As a result, Spinoza's God is not a personal God. He does not create the universe, no individuals, reveal laws, etc., etc. He's far more like the sort of God we encountered in the speech of Judah Halevi's philosopher in our study of medieval philosophy. A God who does not, for it cannot, care about individuals. Now, this is how the ethics begins, and the way it ends is no more conducive to traditional religious belief. For in the final 20 propositions, Spinoza deals with what he calls the eternity of the mind, what we might call immortality. And it's pretty clear that Spinoza denies the idea of personal immortality, that you and I will survive our deaths as individuals who know who we are. All that survives for Spinoza are the ideas of ours that are part of the store of eternal ideas in the mind of God, though the word mind here is clearly not to be taken literally when speaking of Spinoza's God. Now, these are just two of the ideas to which Spinoza is led by the use of reason in the Ethics. And for the moment, one might be unsure quite why he was excommunicated for these views, given their similarities to some of the views we found among our medieval rationalists. Now, Spinoza's treatise, on the other hand, the theological political treatise, takes more direct aim at key religious beliefs that even our medieval rationalists would have rejected. For the treatise, among other things, is one of the first serious works to question the divine authorship of the Torah. While the traditional view was that God had given Moses the Torah at Mount Sinai, Spinoza argued that the book had actually been put together by human hand in the time of Ezra. This view that the Torah is actually a work composed by human hand, and in fact nowadays people think by a number of different human hands at different times, rather than given by God, this kind of more scholarly academic view that is prevalent in many places nowadays is known as biblical criticism. Spinoza is the first serious biblical critic. And this alone would be enough to get him excommunicated back then by both Jews and Christians. But the implications of that view are even more challenging, because if the work is a human work, then clearly it can contain mistakes. And for Spinoza, indeed, it does, and they're mainly philosophical mistakes. For Maimonides, the Torah is really, beneath the surface, teaching us philosophical truths. But for Spinoza, in direct contrast with Maimonides, who Spinoza actually picks out for specific criticism in the treatise, the Torah is philosophically naive, and obviously so, since its human authors were. So it should not be reinterpreted in accordance with philosophical reason. Philosophy tells us truth. The Torah, on the other hand, should be read as it is, as the record of the religious encounters of an ancient, philosophically unsophisticated people who were simply wrong about the true nature of Spinoza's pantheistic God. Therefore, the amount of truth the Torah contains is highly questionable. But most problematic of all, perhaps from a Jewish perspective, were Spinoza's arguments concerning Jewish law. The traditional view of the mitzvot is that they are part of God's law. They're given by God to the Jewish people, and these mitzvot are binding for all eternity. The traditional view of the historical narratives of the Torah, moreover, is that they are a true historical account of what occurred and they must be believed, since they too are part of the Word of God. Now, what does Spinoza think of these views? The next exercise will take you through his ideas, but to help you along, you should note that for Spinoza, Jewish law, at least its ritual parts, could not be part of divine law. This is where the Enlightenment conception of reason becomes important, for as we know, in the Enlightenment, for something to be rational, it must be universal. Yet even Jews would admit that their ritual laws are not universal. Non-Jews simply aren't required to keep the laws of kashrut, for example. But the problem is, if these laws are not universal, they simply cannot be rational. They can't be binding on us, and indeed cannot be part of divine law, which is concerned with universal rational perfection, to which the ritual laws do not contribute in Spinoza's view. Now, none of this is to say that the Torah has no value or that the ritual laws were never binding. As we will see in the exercise, Spinoza has an explanation of how and why the laws came about and why they're no longer binding, together with an account of what we can learn from the Torah. But clearly, this idea that God's law or divine law must be universal law, and therefore the mitzvot are not divine law, is going to be a major problem for traditional Judaism.